If you're running a game of Dungeons & Dragons or another fantasy-based tabletop role-playing game, chances are that you're running an adventure and that adventure has a story. There's a central conflict, such as a villain to defeat, a treasure to find, an innocent to rescue, a catastrophe to avert, or a mystery to solve. And the characters who are charged with resolving that conflict are the characters of your players. That's how it normally goes, anyway. Not all tabletop role-playing game sessions have a story attached to them. Many dungeon masters and their players are perfectly happy to just go through that cycle of killing monsters, finding treasure, leveling up, and repeating. If that's how you play your game, then I have nothing against that. There's no wrong way to enjoy this. However, this video does concern storytelling in your session of D&D or other tabletop role-playing game. In professional game design, we speak of two ways in which storytelling may be related to game mechanics. On one hand, there is directed storytelling, and on the other hand, there is emergent storytelling. These two modes are not entirely distinct, there are borderline cases, and of course most games involve both elements, at least to a little degree. Directed storytelling occurs when a game has a pre-written story, and that story is told to the players as they play. Directed storytelling lets players play through the story, and they typically have no impact on the story other than whether the story actually reaches its completion. Usually, if a game has heavily directed storytelling, players will decide whether the game reaches completion by winning. If they win, the story comes to a conclusion. If they lose, then the story is interrupted with their defeat. In video games, we might look to the old Final Fantasy games as examples of directed storytelling. In Final Fantasy VI, the plot focuses on the plight of an amnesiac wizard who is escaping an evil empire. She throws her lot in with some plucky young rebels and ends up saving the universe from a power-mad wizard tyrant. That's the story. If you want to play through Final Fantasy VI, you play through that story, not some other story. There are no other goals to adopt, no other objectives to seek. As you play through Final Fantasy VI, you play through the story of that particular witch. For contemporary examples, we might consider the games Firewatch, or Stories Untold, or Return of the Obra Dinn, where making correct decisions reveals more and more of an already established narrative. Emergent storytelling, by contrast, occurs when a game does not have a pre-written story, and in which the game's story instead follows the actions of the characters. In a game with purely emergent storytelling, there is no script for the game's plot, nor is there a pre-decided goal or narrative. Instead, the player does, well, whatever they want, and the story of the game is nothing more than the history of their particular choices. In video games, we might think of Minecraft as an example of a game with purely emergent storytelling. In Minecraft, there are no scripted events or pre-established antagonists or goals. You're simply let loose in a world with a wide diversity of options, of choices, and what the player decides to do will settle what the history of the gameplay is, and the story is nothing more than the history of that gameplay. Now, when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons and other fantasy-based tabletop role-playing games, we typically find examples of both kinds of storytelling at work. Most of the modules released by Wizards of the Coast have pre-written villains, conflicts, scripted events, and in that sense have a lot of directed storytelling. However, there are also adventures such as Dragons of Icefire Peak, or arguably the first chapter of Rime of the Frost Maiden, in which the story is much more decided by what the players choose to do. Now, as I explain the difference between directed storytelling and emergent storytelling, some of you may be asking, isn't this the same thing as the difference between a so-called railroaded campaign and a sandbox campaign? And the answer is no, actually. Railroad and sandbox concern styles of play, whereas directed and emergent concern ways that the story hooks on to the game. To see what I mean, consider the fact that there are sandbox-style campaigns which have very directed stories. Curse of Strahd is one. In Curse of Strahd, the player characters are free to wander all over the Valley of Barovia, doing whatever they wish, but it has already been established that they need to face Strahd von Zarovich, that they need to escape Barovia somehow, that they need to gather the sacred items, and so forth. It's a sandbox with directed storytelling. Contrarily, and a bit more bizarrely, we might imagine railroading some players into a funhouse dungeon, like White Plume Mountain. We say to them, we're gonna do White Plume Mountain, here's your starting equipment, begin. And yet, as we railroad them into it, we would allow them to decide why they're there, why it matters, who's waiting for them on the outside, what's at stake exactly. And in this way, despite the railroad, we might actually allow for a great deal of emergent storytelling. So you can easily have a sandbox campaign with directed storytelling, and you can also, more bizarrely, have a railroaded campaign with emergent storytelling. They're not coextensive. The difference between directed storytelling and emergent storytelling is not the same thing as the difference between a railroaded campaign and a sandbox campaign. So why am I bringing this up? What's the issue? Well, I bring up the distinction between directed and emergent storytelling in order to address a certain kind of dogma within the dungeon mastering community. I've heard many game masters say, both online and in person, that the best type of storytelling, if you're running a D&D game, is emergent storytelling. The reasoning is something like this, that a good game of D&D gives the players maximal freedom to adventure and explore on their own terms, to let them do what they want. And the best way to let them do what they want is, of course, to make the world open to them, in the sense that they can adopt whatever goals they wish, pick amongst their choice of antagonists, select dungeons and dangers for themselves, and to let the story of the adventure follow those preferences. If your campaign has purely emergent storytelling, goes the argument, then you have put all the power in the hands of the players. You are being so good to those players. Why, a campaign like that affords so much freedom that any directed storytelling by comparison would amount to a dictatorial railroad. Emergent storytelling all the way? Let the players and the dice decide all. That's the dogma that I want to address. I am going to argue against this view. I'm going to argue that a good D&D campaign needs directed storytelling. I'm going to argue for this point by just noting 3 assumptions and drawing out some implications. Assumption number 1 is that a good story has narrative downbeats. In other words, a good story is one in which not everything always goes well for the protagonists. In a good story, there are upbeats in which something good happens to the protagonist and we're happy for them, but there are also challenges, obstacles, tension, in a word. There are occasions where we worry that all might be lost because things are going badly for our hero or heroine. That's the first assumption, is that a story with no narrative downbeats is a boring one. A good story must have narrative downbeats. The second assumption is it is legitimate and proper for players to want to roll high and to implement successful plans. This is almost just built into the game of D&D. Just by rolling dice in combat, it's constitutive of actually playing that you want to roll to hit, or you want to roll to succeed. A player who is trying to miss or trying to implement plans that will fail is, in a sense, not really engaging with the game. Or at any rate, you cannot blame any players if what they want to do is to roll high and implement successful plans. No dungeon master should ever expect their own players to try to fail or to aim at their own failure. And my third and final assumption is that players should never be put in a position where their goals are coextensive with the telling of a bad story. In other words, if players roll high and implement successful plans, they should be rewarded with an exciting story. Something interesting happens, something exciting happens, something provocative happens that makes them want to keep playing, that, in story terms, rewards them for what they've done. You should not set up a game in which, by rolling high and implementing successful plans, the players are treated to a boring story, in which nothing occurs, in which everything is fine and there's no narrative tension. Those are my 3 assumptions. First, that a good story has narrative downbeats. Secondly, it's legitimate and proper for players to try to roll high and implement successful plans. And finally, that no player should be put in a position where their goals are coextensive with the telling of a bad story. Now, with those assumptions in place, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that we have a game where there's only emergent storytelling. We let the players decide the antagonist, the setting, we let them choose where to go, what to do, and there's nothing that does not happen under that fictional sun which is not the result of either the initial conditions or what they want to do and how they roll about it. If that's the kind of campaign we've got, notice something. If the storytelling is purely emergent, what that means is that there will only be narrative downturns when the players roll low, or when they do not implement successful plans? If, after all, everything is up to them, then the only way for things to go badly are for their efforts to go badly. The only way for there to be a narrative downbeat in the story, in other words, is if they, despite their efforts, roll low, or they, despite their efforts, implement a plan that is not successful. But if that's the kind of campaign that we have, then players, just by dint of trying to roll high and implement successful plans, are going to try to end up with a story without narrative downbeats. And if their efforts are going to lead to a story that has no narrative downbeats, then we have just put the players in a position where their goals are coextensive with the telling of a bad story. We've ended up with a campaign style where what the players are trying to do is to keep themselves out of narrative tension, out of a story in which there's something at stake, out of a story in which there is adventure and risk and excitement. If you implement emergent storytelling, and only emergent storytelling in other words, your players are going to be working against your efforts to tell a story. They're going to want to make sure everything goes fine, that they are never in danger, and that nothing bad happens to them. Well, what should they do, you might ask? Try to fail? No, of course not. Remember assumption 2. Instead, we should just allow for other storytelling besides emergent storytelling. And that's where the narrative downbeats will come from. A downturn in the story when things go badly for our players does not have to be when they roll natural ones. It could be because they defeated the boss only to discover a betrayal. Or they finally reach the top of the mountain only to encounter a whirlwind. Or they finally get the treasure they've been hunting for only to discover it was an ambush. These are all narrative downbeats, and they are all directed storytelling, which allows for those beats to be exciting and not to be disappointments or poor performance on the player's part. You need to have some directed storytelling in there. Sometimes bad stuff has to happen to the players because the DM wants it to. That may sound weird, but what's the alternative? Yikes. Anyway, that's my little argument about why we need directed storytelling in a D&D campaign. Why you should not just let everything be up to your players and let them choose the antagonist and let them choose the dungeon and let them choose the setting and let them choose the terms of the adventure and everything. If you let them do that, then there will only be tension when they fail, and because they don't want to fail, understandably, they will be trying to have an adventure which just so happens to be boring. Avoid boredom. Direct your stories. That's it for this video. Thanks everyone for watching. Again, do all the internet stuff please. Click like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell icon if you want to get notifications about new content on this channel. Thanks very much.